Hi guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and today I am going to be doing a video talking about the Indiana Pacers and their team between the years of around 2011 to 2014, and I'm going to be discussing their many battles with the Heat and what was really the thing that was holding the Pacers back from getting over the hump, beating the Heat, and being the Eastern Conference champ in a few of those seasons. So as a little bit of background, I'll tell you a little bit about the Pacers before we get into the reasons that I don't think that they beat the Heat and all that. So a little bit of background, their core, starting in around 2010, was Roy Hibbert and Danny Granger. And those were like the main two guys. And then in 2011, they signed David West as a free agent, and they had Paul George was drafted in 2010 but didn't really play his rookie year, so then in 2011 to 12 he started becoming a regular starter. In 2011 they had a draft pick and got Kawhi Leonard, but then traded him to the Spurs for George Hill to be a sixth man for them. So then George Hill was coming off the bench. And their core was looking like this. So in 2011 to 12, their main rotation was Darren Collison starting at point guard, Paul George at shooting guard, Danny Granger at small forward, David West power forward, Roy Hibbert at center, and then coming off the bench they had, let's see here, who was? They had a very young Lance Stevenson who wasn't playing all that much, and then the guy I just mentioned, George Hill, he was also their sixth man. He was sort of like playing a little bit of shooting guard sometimes with Collison, but also subbing in for Collison at point guard too. So he was getting a good amount of minutes. So it was essentially those five starters and George Hill were the main players on this team. And in that 2011 to 12 year, it was a lockout shortened season, but if you adjust their win total, they were a 52 win team that year. If you're going with like a regular 82 game season, they would have won 52 games on that pace that they were on. The Pacers on the pace that they were on. But so you look at that team, and they were the 3 seed that year, and they played the Orlando Magic in the first round without Dwight Howard and beat them. And then they got to the Heat in the second round, and it made sense to me that the Heat won this series because the Pacers were still kind of new to like being a good playoff team. They had gotten to the playoffs the year before in the 2011 playoffs, but they were a 37 and 45 win team that year and somehow just snuck in as the 8th seed and lost in a sweep, or it was 5 games I think, to the Bulls. So they weren't like very playoff experienced at this point. David West had been in the playoffs a few times with the Hornets, but they never really got out of the first round basically, except for 1 or 2 years. So he had been in the playoffs, but like not much experience doing well in the playoffs. And the rest of the roster, essentially, besides George Hill, who had been on the Spurs and got into the playoffs a few times, were really inexperienced, I should say, when it comes to like playoff basketball and the pressure that comes with that. And I just don't think that they were ready for the moment exactly, and they maybe wilted under the pressure a bit. Also, at this point, Danny Granger was still the best player on the team, and Paul George hadn't really fully bloomed into the player that we know him as today. He was only averaging around 12 points a game that season, instead of what we normally think of him averaging around 20. Danny Granger in 2011 to 12 was averaging around 18 points a game as their leading scorer, and David West was getting around 12, 13 a game, and Roy Hibbert was getting around 12 a game, and Collison and George Hill were each getting around 10 or 11 points a game. So they had a very balanced attack, and almost everybody in double digits. And then Danny Granger was like the definitive number 1 scoring option, you'd say, probably with like David West as the second option. But I think the problem with that style too was that like because they had so many like decent players also in the clutch, you knew you had Danny Granger, but like you didn't really know who was that second guy that was going to step up. As I said, David West was sort of the de facto second option because he was a former All-Star and good at scoring in his prime in the post. But like at this point, he was older and like not really in the prime of his career anymore. So like, was he really like the guy that was going to be able to like put up 20 if you really needed it, or was he the guy that's going to give you 15 and 6? So I think from that standpoint, they had a problem that another team that was really good had a problem with earlier on in the history of the NBA, which I would compare them a little bit to the Portland Trailblazers around 1999 to 2000 with like Scottie Pippen and Steve Smith and Rasheed Wallace and Sabonis and all them. You look at that team, and Rasheed Wallace averaged 18 points a game, but then they had like 5 other guys averaging around like 12 points a game. And it was like, well, that's really good because you got a lot of guys capable of scoring, but like, who's really like the go-to option in the clutch? Because everyone is a decent enough scorer and no one's like significantly better than the rest besides one player. But like when that one player is doing all they can, you need the other guys to step up. And there wasn't really a great pecking order for that team or for this Pacers team. Like I feel like each guy could kind of make a case that they should be the one to have the ball when Granger was out of the game, or when Granger, was already scoring a ton and they just needed another guy to step up. Who was going to be that guy? I feel like sometimes it can definitely work by committee, like the Detroit Pistons in the early 2000s, but in a lot of cases I feel like you need more of like a direct pecking order of, okay, this guy gets his shots off first, then you, then you, then you, which the Pacers didn't really have in this season, just because they had a lot of guys who were like emerging and a lot of guys who like more like David West were like kind of coming down, and then a lot of guys like Roy Hibbert and like George Hill and Collison who were like average scorers, but like when they're given a chance, they can score a decent amount at this point in their careers. So you didn't really know where they fit in either, because like they're capable, but they're not like better scorers than certain other guys. So just a hard time figuring out like what was the pecking order, as I think was what the main problem was this season with the Pacers, along with the Heat being more experienced and just more talented, I'd say at this point. So yeah, that would be the main problem then with that year. So then moving on to the 2012 to 13 season, the Pacers got rid of Darren Collison, or he signed with another team as a free agent. So then George Hill was promoted to the starting point guard slot. And this was the year that we saw a big emergence from both Paul George and Lance Stephenson. But the unfortunate thing is that these emergences were caused by the injury to Danny Granger, their leading scorer. So for those of you that don't know, Danny Granger was a very good NBA player in his prime. His best season, he averaged 26 points a game. He had another year where he averaged like 25, and then another season where he averaged 20, and then like 2 others where he averaged around 18, which was the season prior where he averaged 18 a game. He was just like a really good player, but had a really short prime because he had a lot of injury problems. And so, unfortunately, this 2012 to 13 season is when his injuries started to set in, and he only played 5 games this year, essentially missed the entire season. So the Pacers were looking for someone to fill that scoring void, and it turned out to be Paul George. His scoring average jumped from 12 points a game to 17. He was the new number 1 option for the team. He won Most Improved Player of the Year. Lance Stephenson became a starter, averaging more like 10 to 12 a game. David West, George Hill, and Roy Hibbert all maintained their same amount of scoring averages, like George Hill around 10, 11 a game. David West like 13, 14 points. Roy Hibbert still averaging around 11 or 12 points and like 9 rebounds a game. So the big difference was the emergence of Stephenson and Paul George. The team had like okay depth, not great depth, just a bunch of like role players, no significant sixth man who could come in and light it up. So they weren't super deep, but they were okay. I mean, it wasn't like they had a terrible bench. They just didn't have very many notable players, and they were just relying heavily on their starters, I'd say, at this point. So in this year in the playoffs, they got to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals with the Heat, and they were very close to getting to the finals. A lot of people were thinking that they might pull it off actually and beat the Heat and get to the finals, but they didn't. They lost in the 7th game, and I think the main problem with this series is that, well, they were missing Danny Granger, which obviously I think that if you look at this whole Pacers run, if they would have had Paul George come into his prime like he did and have a healthy Danny Granger, we might see a different Eastern Conference champ and possibly even a different NBA champion in a couple of these seasons, namely 2013 and 14, because those are the years that the Pacers were really doing well. Just a quick bit of background to backtrack a little bit. The Pacers won 49 games this year and were again the 3 seed in the East, and they beat the Knicks were the team that they beat to get to the conference finals. They beat Carmelo Anthony and Amari and Tyson Chandler and all those guys. But so I think the problem this year was just like, again, a little bit of inexperience, honestly, in that Paul George hadn't really been given the mantle of being like the primary option yet. The last year, like Danny Granger was shouldering most of the load that they had to take on offense, and so the other guys were sort of taking a back seat. But now I think they all felt more of this sense of like having to step up and perform harder because arguably their best player was out. You know, you might say that Paul George was the best player by this point, but I'd say if Danny Granger was healthy, he would have been the best player on the team. So yeah, I think a little bit of inexperience, and like again, this team like had a good amount of quality players, but again, it's hard to do the pecking order when everyone is like having the same amount of offensive output between George Hill and Stevenson and David West and Roy Hibbert. And Paul George still sort of easing into the whole being the top guy, the top option. He still at this point was only like 22 years old, which I think we got to remember is that like these young guys, sometimes the new situation and adjusting to everything is a lot harder than a guy adjusting when he's, say, like 28. So they're still just kind of finding their rhythm, and I think a good comparison for what this team was like the 2011 Thunder, which is when they lost to the Mavericks in the Western Conference Finals. Like they were a good team, and they had like essentially the same talent that they would have the next year. Like they still had Harden, Durant, Westbrook, Ibaka, but somehow they just weren't quite ready the year before, even though they probably were even the more talented team than the Mavericks. I see a similar thing with these Pacers. They maybe weren't more talented than the Heat, but they have the same talent that they would have the next year, and I don't know, I think it's just like they weren't prepared. They had played the Heat before, so they were prepared to play them, and they were familiar with them, but again, I think the pecking order was a little bit of a factor. And getting into just overall like the actual gameplay, when you look at how the Heat are structured, they played a lot of small ball with Bosh at center, and then Battier at the 4 position, LeBron at the 3, Wade at the 2, Chalmers at the 1, and so I just think that when you have that sort of lineup, you're going to draw David West and Roy Hibbert out to the 3-point line more. They did a really good job of defending the Heat. Roy Hibbert was shutting down the Heat a lot of times, getting a lot of blocks, but when they have that floor spacing, when you can bring Roy Hibbert out to the 3-point line more, or David West if it's Shane Battier shooting the 3, that's going to open a lot of things up for the Heat, and LeBron can basically overmatch Paul George as far as rebounding at this point in their careers because he's just so much bigger and more experienced, and he is just a better rebounder overall, so that opened up space for him to play in the post more and be able to secure more rebounds and have a post-up game more, which he had been learning at that point in his career. And it just created a lot more spacing for them, and the Pacers played really traditional where they'd have 2 big guys that really can't shoot at all and just played in the paint, and that really limited them in that they were playing very traditional and really at any given time only had 2 to 3 guys on the court that could shoot, so the paint was getting really clogged up and defenses could sort of predict what they were doing more. They were really much more of a defensive team than an offensive team. Paul George is the only all-star caliber offensive player. Like Roy Hibbert was a great defender at this point and made 2 all-star teams based on his defense, but like their offense was decent, but just not like the best defense. It was like an average offense, but just a great defense is the how I would describe them. And so when the Heat were doing that, where they were spreading the court and getting Bosh out at the 3-point line, the Pacers defense was slightly more neutralized because what they really wanted to do was keep Hibbert right in the paint to stop LeBron and be able to contest and block him. But when he's dragged out to the 3-point line, it opens up the lane for LeBron. He's able to penetrate, get past his defender, whether it be Paul George or somebody else, and then he's able to distribute or score or whatever he wants to do with it. And the defense can't help and sag in because if Roy Hibbert's going to come off of Chris Bosh and sag in, then LeBron, when he's driving, is going to kick it out to Bosh for the open three. And so this is where you saw the ultimate clash of the new age basketball style versus the old age, because the Pacers were trying to play traditional ball, and the Heat were like one of the first waves of playing everyone on the court can shoot it, and you play a little bit smaller and faster. And so it was a really interesting way to look at just like how the two styles clash and how they match up against one another. So that was a little bit of a tangent just on the overall play of the two teams, but now I'm going to get into the, again, specifics of 2013-14. The Pacers won 56 games. They were doing great. They were the top team in the East. They had traded Danny Granger at this point because he was still very injury prone and really not playing at all. So they traded him to Philadelphia for Evan Turner, who was at the time averaging 17 points a game, having a career season for himself. And the plan was to have him be the sixth man and sort of replace what Danny Granger was bringing them 2 years prior, so then they could finally see what it would be like to have like two really good wing scorers. Unfortunately, Evan Turner, once he got there, was not as good as he had been in Philadelphia, because he was like the #1 undisputed option in Philadelphia, and he was arguably like the 3 or 4 option in Indiana. So he was only averaging 12 points a game while he was with them, shooting like 40% from the field, so not very good, and like 32% or like 30% from 3. So his numbers had gone down, his efficiency went down. I think he just was an example of a guy who was really comfortable having the ball in his hands a lot and didn't have the ball in his hands as much in Indiana, so he struggled to play off ball a bit more. But this year the Pacers really were they were ready. They had faced the Heat the past 2 years. They had gotten to the Eastern Conference Finals, Game 7. They had the playoff experience. Paul George was finally mature enough to handle big moments, and he was just ready to arrive. His scoring average jumped up to 20 points a game from 17. Lance Stephenson went from around 10 points a game up to 15, and then you got Hibbert and David West and George Hill still giving you the same amount, around like 13 for West, 12 for Hibbert, around 10 to 12 for George Hill, and then you had Evan Turner off the bench as a sixth man with 12 points a game. So this team was good. Again, like an okay offensive team, a really good defensive team, but still the same things plagued them in the playoffs, and you just saw the heads butting again of the two styles, where the Pacers played traditional and the Heat played a more up-tempo and space and pace, and ultimately the space and pace won. And I think Roy Hibbert was a bit exposed in these playoffs, and I think we can all remember that first series when they played Atlanta, when Roy Hibbert had these games where he was finishing the game with like 0 points and 1 rebound, and it was like really bizarre, and he was having a terrible playoffs, and somehow he just lost his mojo. And I think that in a way the Pacers, maybe just because they had worked so hard in the regular season to get such a good record, were maybe mentally or physically fatigued by the time they got to the playoffs, and it was sort of like once the Heat were more hungry, I think, than the Pacers were for some reason. Even though the Pacers were the young team, or the younger team that was still more up and coming, the Heat just had their number, and much like LeBron has had a lot of teams' numbers, they were just so used to losing to LeBron. It's really hard to explain. It's sort of like the current Toronto Raptors, how they just perpetually lose to LeBron. That when he was on the Heat, the team who he had the number of was really the Pacers. Somehow they just could never beat him, and I think what I'm boiling all this down to is the main reason. I'm going to say it's 3 reasons why. The main reason was right when they were becoming a contender, the Pacers, is when their best player went down with like essentially a career-ending injuries, which was Danny Granger. He went from a guy that could give you 20 a night to a guy that missed almost 2 full seasons and then was like a shell of himself afterwards, and they had to trade him. The second reason I'll say is that, let's see here. Oh, the two styles of play, like the Heat playing the new age space and pace run and gun style more often, and really focusing on the transition game and getting out in the fast break and trying to run a lot. And then the Pacers playing the slowed down traditional 2 big guys that are always in the paint, a really tall center that's really defensive, and more of a hard-nosed defensive style. So you saw those two styles clash, and as we see now, where the whole modern NBA is clearly chosen one style over the other, the traditional style lost and the new age style won. And it's because the defense it's a lot harder to keep up with the new age offense with all the shooting and spacing on the floor. And a traditional center who's as big as Roy Hibbert can't move fast enough to keep up with that. And David West was also older and more bulky and could not keep up with it either. So the Pacers were playing a dinosaur style of basketball, I guess is what I'm going to say. And they did not have enough shooting and spacing to keep up with the Heat's offense. Because although the Pacers were great on defense, they were average on offense. And the problem was the Heat were both good on offense and defense. So they were good all around, whereas the Pacers were like an average offensive team and a great defensive team. So the Heat had an advantage when they were on offense. Or you could say, I guess, when they were on defense, because the Pacers were only an average team in that regard. So the third reason, I think, is that essentially the Pacers had good players, but it's like, would you rather have 4 good role players, or would you rather have like 2 good stars? Like, yes, it's really nice to have like a team where like 6 guys can score in double digits for you, but the Heat more went with the let's just have 3 guys that can score and everybody else just like, you know, get rebounds and assists and steals and blocks, because that's sort of what their style was. You didn't see a lot of other guys besides the big 3 for the Heat scoring. Whereas I feel like with the Pacers, it was like, okay, we're going to do the style where we have 1 star and everyone else just contributes a little bit, and then we'll kind of be greater than the sum of our parts by our teamwork and stuff. But again, as we've seen in recent years, it's probably more beneficial to have a few stars and a bunch of worse players rather than to have 1 star and like a lot of really good quality rotation role. Like, I don't want to say role players because that makes them sound like bench players, but like just quality starters. It seems like what I learned from this series is that it's better to have more stars because they can do better in the clutch, whereas like just a quality starter can shrink in the clutch way easier than a star can. Because Paul George didn't shrink in the clutch in these series, really. He still put up his numbers, even though he might not have been as ready in the first couple of series as he was in the last one. But like a guy like George Hill, like no one really bats an eyelash if he goes from shooting like if he goes from scoring 12 points a game to like 9. It doesn't seem like a big difference, but it is, honestly. 3 points is a big deal. Let's say David West goes from averaging 14 a game in the regular season to 12 in the postseason. It's a bigger deal than it seems. And then Roy Hibbert. Roy Hibbert is he was a mess in the last playoff series. In the last season, in their playoff run, he was a mess. He just broke down, had maybe, I don't know what the deal was, a mental breakdown, I don't know. But so that's the story of the Pacers and how they were never able to get over the Heat. I found this team really interesting, and I've always had a soft spot for them because I really wanted to see what would have happened with Danny Granger. If he was healthy with that core, I think they would have been a great team. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.